Good evening, everybody. Friends, as you all know, today is our Honorable Rahul Gandhi ji's birthday. So we wish him a very happy birthday on behalf of MPCC, Legal, Human Right and RTI Department. Friends, as you know, today is a very important day and a very honorable day for our MPCC legal department, as we have with us the legends, the great legal luminaries amongst us, who are going to enlighten us with all their wisdom and with all their knowledge. So very soon I will be introducing them. But meanwhile, a very warm and very cordial and sincere welcome to all of you. This is our fifth episode of Law and Policy Series 2021. I request our Honorable Chairperson, Advocate Asif Ji Kurezi, who is a former chairman of Maharashtra Goa Bar Association, chairman and also presently the member of Maharashtra Bar Mumbai and Goa Bar Association. I welcome him. He has been doing a lot of work for our Bar Association, for our MPCC legal department, especially he had wonderful drive of membership all over Maharashtra. Today we are lot of advocates who have joined Congress and become the member of our legal department. We do a lot of legal aid. We do a lot of awareness of legal rights for the senior citizens, for the women, and for any important issues, whatever is required time and again. So, such a personality who has been doing great work for our department, none other than Advocate Asif Ji Kureji, our chairman. With great honor, I welcome him to address and welcome the gathering.
Thank you, Gauri Madam. First of all, a very warm welcome to everyone today to our Law and Policy series, episode number 5. I would also like to take this opportunity to wish our leader, Voice of India, Sri Rahul Ji Gandhi, a very happy birthday. Starting with today's webinar, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce two legal luminaries who are present with us today, who are going to enlighten us with their expertise area of law. Firstly, Honorable respected Sri Salmanji Khurshid, sir, former Union Law Minister, senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India, a writer, an exceptional political leader, and much more to the people of this country. I am delighted to tell you that Mr. Honorable Shri Khurshid sir will be speaking on judges and constitution. I have personal knowledge of the exceptional works that Honorable Shri Khurshid ji has done towards our judiciary system as a lawyer and a political leader. Today's topic and its discussion will have an immense impact on everyone who is present here today. Considering the situation of our justice judicial system and the past violations of the Constitution in the recent year, sir, I am honored to welcome you on this webinar series. Now, Justice Abhay Tipse, sir, who has been associated with MPCC legal department since the last few years, has been tremendously asset to our organization. Justice Tipse, former High Court judge of Bombay and Allahabad High Court, has a remarkable career as a judge, as well as a lawyer and legal expert. Justice Tipse sir is going to speak on challenges to the independent working of judiciary role of the bar. Is yet another topic and that needs thoughtful consideration. Independence of judiciary is of immense importance for an unbiased and equitable judicial system. That is in need of our today, sir. I thank you for you being here today. I welcome you once again, sir, and welcome on behalf of MPCC Legal Department. Thank you very much, sir. Now, the webinar series, I have declared that this webinar series is inaugurated. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, sir, for inaugurating our 5th webinar series. I'm really grateful to all of you who have joined today in this particular Zoom webinar. I would request all of you to please go on the chat box and give your comments. Also, we will be having a question answer session. So you all please put your questions at the chat box, and our Sanjukta and Ravindra will be taking care to get the questions. So please be free. We are here to answer you. Our dignitaries are here to answer you all your queries. So please keep on commenting as and when you feel. So let me go ahead to introduce today's first legend, a legal luminary who is present here today all the way from Delhi. We are really truly honored and privileged to have him here today. Salman Khurshid Alam Khan is an Indian politician, designated senior advocate, eminent author, and a law teacher. He was the cabinet minister of the Ministry of External Affairs. He belongs to the Indian National Congress. He is a lawyer and a writer who has been elected from Farrukhabad Lok Sabha constituency in the general election of 2009. He belongs to Farrukhabad area. Prior to this, he was elected to the 10th Lok Sabha 1991-1996. From the Farrukhabad Lok Sabha constituency, he became the Union Deputy Minister of Commerce in June 1991 and later became the Union Minister of State of External Affairs January 1993, June 1996. He started his political career in the year 1981 as an officer on special duty in the Prime Minister's Office PMO under the Prime Ministership of Srimati Indira Gandhi. Friends, I had an opportunity along with a study tour of Government Law College as a professor to visit Sir in Delhi and also with a legal team to visit his office. And what an experience and memories. I'm sure today all of you all are privileged and honored to have him here virtually on the Zoom webinar. And very soon he will be starting his talk, his wonderful speech with great honor and respect, sir. I welcome you to please address the gathering today on the topic Judges and Constitution. Over to our Honorable Shri Salman Khurshid ji, our leader of Congress.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, and I'm so pleased that this is.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I'm speaking on a topic that would I believe find favor with him, and when Justice Sifte addresses us, he will, I'm quite sure, be able to shed more light on what I'm going to say. But delighted that so many of you are present this afternoon, and I consider it a great honor to be addressing you. I said I would speak on judges and the Constitution, but why unravel about judges and certainly not unravel everything there is about the Constitution. But there is a very critical link between what the judge does and what the Constitution provides. And I think I would want to focus on that. It's important because it's part of the conversation that is happening in the country today. Periodically, we speak of independence judiciary. Periodically, we speak about how judiciary is under threat and how the ultimate protection and defense of the civil liberty has to come from our judiciary, and our judiciary inevitably come such a moment of this, that our judiciary will stand firm and tall, give us the content of our as per the system life that makes things meaningful. I would have started with something else, but let me just very briefly start with something really remarkable that happened in the Delhi High Court recently. Delhi ago, when the division bench of the Delhi High Court read down right I said that there is a very clear distinction between criminal criminal conduct, no matter how heinous it may be, and something that we call terrorism. That terrorism is a very particular kind of crime, but it is to be defined in a different way from any criminal conduct. Every criminal conduct is bad. Every criminal conduct has an impact, but not every criminal conduct can be said to shake the foundations of governance and of the country. In other words, the safety, sovereignty, stability of the nation state is not necessarily, it cannot be necessarily said, would be impacted and affected adversely by a particular crime. And if it is affected adversely by a particular crime, then that crime could be described as terrorism. There is an intent and there is an intensity in the criminal conduct which is defined as terrorism, which is directed against the state, not just metaphorically directed against society. Every murder, every rape, every theft, every lynching is directed against society, but it still doesn't automatically qualify to be terrorism because there is no mental element or there is no mens rea which is against the constituted state that to undermine the state. And this is a very clear distinction that the Delhi High Court has made. The Delhi High Court also then said that while we are looking at it, let's look at the right to disagree, the right to protest, the right to dissent. These are matters on which, for times immemorial, the law has been clear as far as the stated law is concerned by the Supreme Court. But in recent times, in the application of those principles, particularly by the government of the day, and regretfully, because of the circumstances in which it happens, that a lot of small courts, lower courts, trial courts, and younger judges find it very difficult to withstand the pressure to say that this is wrong, because you do have to take into account a lot of public opinion and public pressure. There, of course, the High Court has said that no matter how discomforting and despicable and unacceptable to somebody in power or establishment a dissent or a protest might be, that doesn't make it terrorism. And they've even said that if there is violence, for instance, we always say that you have a right to protest peacefully, so that if you pick up a stone, it no longer remains the right to protest, and therefore the state and prosecution would be entitled to come down upon you because you've picked up a stone. But picking up a stone, again, going beyond the right to protest and the right to peacefully protest, the picking up the stone also still doesn't turn it into terrorism. All it does is it qualifies your right that you're right that you have under Article 19, Article 21. It's qualified to an extent. Now, this was a what is the word I use? Staggering. This was wonderful. This was fantastic judgment that the Delhi High Court has given, and I think it should be in the annals of judicial history. It should be written out in golden letters. But within 3 days or 4 days, the state appealed against it, the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has quite rightly said that this is very vast. There will be an implication of this, and we need to study it. We need to examine it more carefully. We won't interfere with the bail that has been granted in this case, but we do want to examine everything. And I think that one cannot have an issue with the Supreme Court saying we are the highest court, and this is a very important matter of national importance, and therefore we will want to examine it. And for that purpose, we are issuing notices and we are asking people to file their affidavits and file their submissions, and we will then, in due course, after 4 weeks or after 6 weeks, hear this matter. That, I believe, is wonderful, and I believe that that's absolutely the right thing for the court to have done. We are not really now going to talk about all this has already taken a year. They were 1 whole year, they were in custody. The 3 of the petitioners were in custody. Now the sword will continue to hang on their heads, etc., because the court might take another 3 months. It may take another 6 months to decide this matter, pronounce on it, even if it's given an urgent hearing, etc., etc. It'll still be quite some time. Now that's a different issue altogether, which we're not concerned with today. But then the Supreme Court went on to say something interesting. The Supreme Court said that this will not be treated as a precedent for, obviously, such time as the court can take a final view. Now, this is something that often happens when the court is disposing of a matter. When the court, now, be that right, wrong, etc., we've looked at it and we believe this is perhaps the best thing to do, and we are disposing of the matter. We are concluding it. We are putting a lid, but we don't want this to become a precedent for another case that comes through. I've never really understood that. When somebody at the highest level in the Supreme Court is doing something in a particular way and saying something in a particular manner, that would not be treated as a precedent, knowingly or unknowingly, that it will not have a psychological shadow on whoever else lower down is going to decide a similar matter in due course of time. It's very difficult to assume that it will work that way. But be that as it may, even if it works or whatever, the question is, today the court hasn't decided finally. So in a sense, the law is in a limbo. And for all practical purposes, a judge hearing this matter somewhere, particularly if it happens to be a trial court, etc., will have to say, I cannot accept what Delhi High Court has said is binding, because the Supreme Court has said this is not to be a binding precedent till such time as we decide. Now, I asked myself this question, and I will be very delighted to hear Justice Tipsey on this. If another high court is hearing this similar matter, same facts as the Delhi High Court, what is that other high court to do? That other high court will say, no, we cannot take this matter to be persuasively or conclusively or bindingly decided by the Delhi High Court, because the Supreme Court said this will not be a precedent. So we will hear this matter afresh. Now, if the High Court hears the matter afresh, goes through those 2 weeks, 3 weeks hearing, etc., and comes to a conclusion that UAPA is to be read down, would that be in violation of the Supreme Court? But of course, if that High Court said, we will follow what the Delhi High Court has said, then it would be in violation of what the Supreme Court has said. So this is a worrisome thing where the issue is that of liberty. It's a worrisome thing to let things in flux, to leave things in a limbo for people not to be certain and be clear that they have a right. And what are we talking about is not a right to do something that they have done. We are only talking about, should they be incarcerated at the stage before the trial happens, or should they be entitled to bail, as the law generally stands, that everyone has a right to bail, and bail is the rule and jail is the exception. UAPA is what turns that rule around, and UAPA is what the High Court has found fault with. Now, would another High Court, if it finds fault with, will the another High Court stifle itself and say, we do seem to find fault with it, but we don't want to act because the Supreme Court has given some indication? So I think that's a worrisome thing. But let me come to my topic itself now. This is the backdrop. And the backdrop is when a judge has to decide something, whether in the Supreme Court and the High Court, what does the judge do? It's very easy to say he should just follow the law, he should follow the Constitution, he should just read the Constitution and see what Constitution says, and then just ditto it. Now, it's easier said than done, because what the Constitution says and the facts that come before the judge often give or pull in two different directions. And we know this. We know this from the fact that going from the High Court to the Supreme Court, you can get a different view. That dissenting judges in the High Court and the Supreme Court can give a different view. That the dissent of one judge against a huge number of judges in the fundamental rights case can subsequently be endorsed by a majority. 25 years later, it can be endorsed by a majority on the Supreme Court itself. So whenever there is a critical issue about the life and the conduct and the behavior and the consequences of our behavior in view of what the law is, there can be two views, and there often are two views. And though judges try very hard to have unanimous judgments, and unanimous judgments are often preferred, we do know a lot of the vitality of law comes from dissenting judgments, and the dissenting judgment of one generation becomes the dominant view of another generation. And this is true about the American Supreme Court, it's true about the UK courts, it's true about the Indian courts. Now, there is an issue of what should you do with precedents and so on and so forth, and when should you depart from precedent, when should you overrule past views, etc. But that's where my topic of judges and the Constitution comes. How do you read the Constitution? And when you read the Constitution, how do you read it one way or the other? And there are two models that you can apply. One model is, let's take everyone's opinion, and the larger number of people, like in a democracy, larger number of people say, this is a case where we should take a restrictive view of the law, or a larger number of people say that this is a case where we should take a liberal and a more open view of law. That's not what a judge does. The judge cannot ask for an opinion poll. The judge can't ask for a vote. The judge can't ask people to give their opinions to him, except to the limited extent that a judge will ask a lawyer to appear on one side and another lawyer to appear on another side. So can you actually go to the people and say what is that you want, just as a parliamentarian goes to the people to say what is that you want? Can a judge do this? Can a judge look at something called morality? Can a judge look at some of his own personal opinions? The answer is, a judge, by his training and by his mandate, is not allowed to do any of that. So a judge might think something is despicable and bad, but yet if the law allows that despicable and bad thing to be done, then the judge has to accept it. So where and how does the judge find this? And I believe that in the recent judgments of the Supreme Court, this is indicated by a phrase that's been used in the Supreme Court in several judgments from the time of Chief Justice Deepak Mishra, and that is morality. constitutional morality. We used to know about constitutionalism. We used to know about constitutional values. We used to know about basic structure. We used to know about constitution and adherence to the constitution in letter and spirit. But now suddenly we are told there is a morality. Obviously, this morality is different from the morality in the street. Obviously, this morality is different from morality that we get from systems of ethics and morality from religion. Obviously, this morality is a different animal, as it were. And how do we get a fix on this morality is the big question in the years to come. Now, in one case of Sabrimala, the 4 male judges, the men on the bench, all said that Sabrimala should be looked at one way, and the only lady judge there, Justice Malhotra, said, no, you look the other way. Both relied upon constitutional morality. So constitutional morality, like most morality, questions of ethics and morality are and can be essentially controversial. But I think the future for us lies in looking at constitutional morality. What is the constitutional morality? If the judges of the High Court were to ask, they would find the decision they have taken to be supported by the totality of the constitutional values and the morality that we can imbibe from the Constitution, Article 21, all the way from Maneka Gandhi to the decision that is now being taken. And if the Supreme Court finds that it has an issue, it is worried about the implications and the consequences of what the Delhi High Court has said or done, then the Supreme Court also will have to see whether, despite the consequences of what the Delhi High Court has done, there is a constitutional morality that prevents them from interfering with what the Delhi High Court has done. Therefore, we ask this question: the constitutional morality that says we cannot and must not keep people in prison without a trial, that nobody should be punished without a trial, the constitutional morality that says that nobody should be tortured, even if torturing that person will give you some truth that may be useful for society. And even if majority of the people in the country say this person is wrong, assuming that the majority of people in India say that what the 3 petitioners did is wrong and it amounts to terrorism, it is not for a judge to dutifully just accept it, because the judge will have to look at constitutional morality. And I believe that looking at constitutional morality honestly, it would not be possible to depart from the view that the Delhi High Court took. These are just some thoughts that I hope you will all be able to reflect upon. I believe it is very important for the future of our governance and the future of the system of rights that we believe in. And I do hope that we will get some more enlightenment on these topics, on this topic, from a very eminent former judge of the High Court of Bombay and Allahabad. Thank you very much.
We are really going to carry with us all wonderful thoughts and your experiences, what you have shared with us. Sir, I would request our Honorable Chairperson Asif Ji Qureshi to please virtually honor you. Over to our Asif Ji Qureshi to virtually honor our Honorable Salman Khurshid Ji.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So with great honor, we would like to honor you to our Honorable Salman Khurshid Ji.
Sir, thank you very much.
Thank you
for enlightening us, sir. Thank you.
Before I request and introduce our second guest, I would once again like to thank all our viewers for having joined us. Kindly please go on the chat box and give all your comments and also the questions which you would like to know. So these are these wonderful pictures, the memories we have with Salman Ji while we were in Delhi. When we went to meet him, these are legal luminaries. As you can see, our professors, and you can see our students who are now, some of the students have become judges, magistrates also, and counsels. This we visited our sir's house when we went there, our delegate of MPCC legal department. we got a warm welcome. Some sweet memories we have. So now we go ahead with our second speaker, our another legend, a legal luminary, none other than Honorable Justice Abhay Mahadev Tipseji. Friends, it is a great honor. He's also our leader in our MPCC legal department. He has been now part of our Congress party and been coming off and on whenever we had required his guidance. He was a judge at the Bombay High Court and Allahabad High Court. He's the brother of the chess player Praveen Tipse. Among the cases he judged in his career were the Best Bakery case and the Sohrabuddin encounter case. His media statements around the cases were controversial too. Well, he is not only enrolled in the Bar Council of Maharashtra and Goa on 5th November, but he also practiced civil and criminal cases in the courts in Mumbai from 1979 August to 1987. Then he was appointed as the Metropolitan Magistrate. Later on also he was promoted as the senior branch of the Judicial Service at the Additional Chief Metropolitan Magistrate. Further, he was appointed as a judge at the Bombay City Civil and Session Court 25th March 1997. And during all his career, the wonderful judgments he has given us, he was also appointed as a special court under the Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act 1999 on 1st September 2001. He was also appointed as a principal district and session judge, Jalgaon. So with all this wonderful journey, then he was special assignment before the elevation of our High Court. So he was in Allahabad High Court, he was in Bombay High Court, and what a wonderful career and great judgments he has given, not only of the BST bakery cases, but many more, which we still remember and we refer. And right now he is doing a lot of good work of arbitration, and also he is a very good coach and a very good player of chess, national level, and also he has been attached to so many such organizations to do legal aid also he does. So there is lots about him that we can talk, but due to shorter time, I would also in the end like to say that recently during lockdown, this is the book I wrote, Challenges in the Time of Lockdown, where our Honorable Abhay Tipseji gave his input. Sir, I take this opportunity to thank you, and wonderful article you have written here during the challenges in the time of lockdown. So with this few words, with great honor and respect, I would like to welcome you to please address us. And I'm really privileged, sir, that you are here amongst us today.
Yes, thank you very much. I am indeed delighted to be here for this fifth episode of the Law and Policy Talks organized by this MPCC Legal Cell. Now, I have had the privilege of hearing Salman Khurshid before I spoke, and what I had decided to speak was rather overlapping, because some of the aspects which he said, I was also to touch them, though in a different way. His experience has been a very different type of experience and much more than my experience, where I had been working only as a judge, oblivious to the other happenings which take outside, means in the process of the appointments and all that. He has been a legislator, a cabinet minister, and he has been practicing in higher courts. So he knows much more about some of the aspects which I would not be knowing. Perhaps I started knowing about that only after my retirement, when I came across senior advocates and used to have discussions with them. Now, the topic which I thought would be fit for me to talk was challenge to the independent functioning of the judiciary and the role of the bar in ensuring that independence. Now, this is a very big topic. We can't have sufficient time to go into very minute details. But I would first tell you that I will first begin with what is meant by this independence and why it is necessary. See, independence of judiciary is a concept that is so well accepted that there is hardly any discussion on what it means. Independence of bar is also linked with the independence of judiciary, and they are interdependent. Now, when it is well accepted that independence of judiciary is necessary, naturally, nobody comes to discuss why it is necessary and what it actually means. But it is universally acknowledged that the constitution of a modern democratic state governed by the rule of law must guarantee judicial independence. And in 1994, United Nations Commission on Human Rights recorded that it was convinced that an independent and impartial judiciary and independent legal system are essential prerequisites for the protection of human rights and for ensuring that there is no discrimination in the administration of justice. Now, as I said, because this principle is widely accepted, there is no opposition to it, and therefore there is no detailed analysis of what it actually means. But I will only broadly say that there are two aspects. There is one aspect which confines itself to this, that independence in the decision making of the judges. And the other aspect is that judiciary has to be an independent institution, free from other branches of the government and a separate arm of the state. So there will be some disputes on the second approach as to what extent the independence is expected to be there. But there is no dispute on this, that in the decision-making process, the judges should be totally independent of the political executive and other arms of the government. Now, this is, necessary to preserve and protect any democracy. And rule of law itself needs that the judges should be independent. Now, without elaborating further on this, I would like to go to just make a brief reference to the provisions in the Constitution which are aimed at protecting the independence of judiciary, because it has been often said that independence of judiciary is a part of the basic structure of our Constitution. So, you know that the procedure of appointment of High Court judges and Supreme Court judges, they are to be appointed by very high executive officers of the state, the president, the highest officer. In practice, it means Prime Minister in consultation with the Chief Justice of India. Will not go into that different interpretations were made of the phrase consultation, and the Supreme Court has switched from one extreme to other extreme. And now that NJSC came, you know all that the NJSC is struck down. So again, the old collegium system continues. Will not go deeper into that, but in according to me, as far as my personal view is concerned, even the collegium system is not working properly. Rather, I would say that nobody says that the appointments made earlier, means prior to the collegium system coming into existence, they were doubtful, or inferior persons were appointed, or unsuitable persons were appointed. On the contrary, such a criticism is more dominant after the collegium system came into being. And I have some personal experience which I don't want to share in this meeting, that how the collegium system works, and I don't think that that's a proper thing. Now some rules have been devised as to how it works, but we are basically, we'll just some of the provisions which are found in the Constitution to ensure the independence. That is, their removal is difficult. Judges of the High Court and Supreme Court, that what is called as impeachment motion, and Articles 124(4) and 217(1) of the Constitution, they lay down the procedure. Then the service conditions of the Supreme Court judge or High Court judge cannot be varied to their disadvantage during their term of their office. That is Article 125 and 221. then the parliament is also barred from discussing the conduct of the judges, except in case of course, impeachment motion. These are articles 121 and 211. So now these are the provisions. I will not go deeper, but are these provisions sufficient to ensure that the judiciary remains independent or is independent? Is coming directly to the question, is the judiciary really independent? Does it decide without fear and favor? I will tell you that what are the attributes of independence. The first of all, I would say that the independence postulates an ability to decide freely without fear and favor, and also with freedom from bias and prejudice in arriving at a decision. And Mr. Salman Khurshid, of course, rightly touched some vital issues. Now, today, the media trials and all that, that is becoming a problem. We'll talk about that in due course. But are the judges working in circumstances in which they can decide without fear or favor? Are they free from bias and prejudice? Now, according to me, the first threat to the independence comes from the attitude of the political executive. The political executive, I may say, Mr. Salman Khurshid has been a part of the political executive. I don't know whether he will agree with me, but generally it is accepted that the political executive feels that independent and impartial judiciary is sometimes an impediment in their decision-making policies for their implementation. In fact, some British authors have said that independent judiciary or independence of judiciary is a concept that will be workable so long the political executive tolerates it. One author has said that it's a result of the tacit understanding between the politicians and the judges, and the politicians don't meddle with the judiciary as a matter of policy. But in our country, there may be some difference, of course, because in Britain, there is United Kingdom, there is no written constitution. We have a written constitution. But then the constitutional interpretations have gone from one extreme to another. We don't have time to discuss all this, particularly about the appointments, the policies, and these transfers. The judgments and views taken are totally different from time to time. But today the scenario is whether the political executive indeed wants fearless and independent judges. Some scholars believe that no political executive would want, and it may be true to a certain extent, but the political executive who is cultured, who is devoted to the constitutional values, who understands the basic norms of democracy, will not be ready to interfere in the judicial decision-making process or do anything which will affect the independence of the judiciary. Now, one would say that what actually prevents the judges from being free and fearless when there are so many constitutional protections. Now, in practice, I don't think that the judges are really fearless and protected because of these provisions. Of course, there are a number of judges who decide against the popular belief without fear, without favor, but that is not because they are protected, because there are some judges who are equally protected, but they succumb to that. Now, this threat is from the political executive who has means of troubling the judges who are felt to be inconvenient, I would say, and there are ways of harassing them despite the constitutional protections, like transfers, that too in violation of the guidelines given by the Supreme Court, then delaying their appointments. I don't want to refer to individual cases, we don't have time, and of course Salman Khurshid will know much more about these things. He has been the man who has been working inside also and outside also, and has a true insight into that. But the another topic which I want to, another thing which I want to mention is that, ironically, I find that one threat to judicial independence comes from media. And this is indeed paradoxical. Means the media, which is one of the pillars of the democracy and is supposed to exercise the freedom of speech and expression guaranteed by the constitution in the public good, should pose a threat to the independence of judiciary, because the media is dependent on judiciary for the protection of its right of freedom of speech and expression. No, but this is happening somehow. Now, the social media has become a nuisance, I would say, and till I retired from the judicial service, I retired as a High Court judge. I did not know that these paid persons are employed by some political parties to put what they call it trolling of a particular person, write bad things about him. Like that, there is trolling of judges about the judgments which they are given just because they are against the ideology of the ruling party or to the government. Sometimes what happens, because of the enormity of the crime and the personalities attached, a lot of publicity is given to that, and these mischievous people are able to create a frenzy by using media, that innocent people also join that viewpoint without knowing anything. I would not, in fact, if we have a workshop, we can discuss, individual cases also. In some cases, of course, we can't decide about pending cases, but the decided cases we can certainly discuss. And this is a topic where one feels that this should be discussed more openly. I, for certain, can say that the judges do fear public criticism and public opinion, and that may not be the real public opinion also. That is what is perceived or a created opinion. A frenzy is created by media, as I said, to put pressure on the judges. So that is a threat to the independence of judiciary. And I would touch some of the points because they are very important points made out by Mr. Salman Khurshid. Now, see, terrorism, he spoke about terrorism. I have had the occasions of talking on these laws relating to this, means Kota, TADA, or even the Organized Crime Control Act, which is not very different from those, though the type of criminals contemplated are different, but the legal provisions are the same. But usually I spoke before these, in the judicial academies, before judicial officers or lawyers. I don't want to do that today, where we analyze the provisions in depth. But I may tell you that these laws, according to me, are somehow their constitutional validity has been upheld in Kartar Singh's case, and in some cases the Supreme Court has upheld. But it's very doubtful. The Supreme Court has tried to read certain provisions down. But I feel that many of the provisions are absolutely unreasonable, and these provisions are not required at all. To tackle crime, these provisions are not required if the investigating agencies are competent, honest, and are capable of performing their duties professionally. If that is so, these laws are not required. Much is said about that. I have seen the very grossest misuse of these laws of UAPA and all that in my career. I have dealt with such matters. I don't want to talk about the cases decided by me particularly, but I may only give some examples. I came across a case while I was in the High Court. It was a bail matter. A person was detained on the charge of having terrorist links, and the provisions were of the UAPA Act. And the only role attributed to him was that there was one accused who was later on found to be involved in some bomb blast which had taken place in Gujarat. And this accused had given a dawat at his residence, and many, about 100 to 150 people were called. So this person was one of them, and he had joined that dawat, and he was there for the dinner. That was the only allegation. I could not find anything else. And on such type of allegation, he was in custody for 4 to 5 years. And in spite of that, when it was a matter for 5 minutes for me to decide, but the resistance of the investigating agencies, these prosecuting agencies, is terrible in such a case. I mean, why it should be that? I used to wonder, when such a weak case is there, why should they feel so much? The reason is this, that they want that once this is branded, he is branded as a terrorist or a person who is dangerous to the society, then the courts should be slow in thinking of his rights. In fact, when such special laws are enacted, special draconian provisions are created, as a legislator, Mr. Salman Khurshid can reflect on that. Uh, See, now, for instance, the confession before the police is made admissible, and the procedure prescribed is same, like what the magistrate has to take precautions. And I will tell you of a shocking judgment of the Supreme Court. You know that the confession has to be voluntary. No civilized society accepts confession which is procured by torture. Even if it is recorded by a magistrate, there is no presumption that it is voluntary. The magistrate has to follow so many norms, so many precautions he has to take. He has to warn the accused. He has to make a proper record of the warning given. And he should make a note that he is satisfied that this is voluntarily given. He has to say what precautions he took to ensure or come to the conclusion that it is voluntary. Now, all this when a judicial magistrate is recording. Similar provisions, were introduced by TADA. Then Supreme Court upheld that legality of confessions before the police. They laid down certain guidelines on that basis. Subsequent legislations, POTA, and they contained these provisions that he should be cautioned, no force should be used. The superintendent should ensure that it is voluntary. It is given by higher ranking police officer. The power is given to higher ranking police officer. These provisions they introduced. And then what happened? In one case, the provisions which the magistrates are required to follow to ensure the voluntariness of the confession, they were not followed by the police officer who recorded the confession. And there were a number of judgments of the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court refused to accept the voluntariness of the confession. And many lawyers do not know that it is for the prosecution to establish voluntary nature of the confession. It's not for the accused to disprove. That's a separate topic, but this is the settled legal position. What I am telling you is the settled legal position. Now, in this was challenged that if the magistrate doesn't take the precautions, this confession cannot be termed as voluntary. This was cited. But the Supreme Court strangely said that these are the precautions required to be taken by the magistrates. They are not applicable to a police officer recording confession under the TADA or POTA. I don't remember whether it was under TADA or POTA, but TADA probably, TADA. POTA, there was some different provisions. But was it not shocking? Tell me, if these provisions are required to be followed, even by magistrates, whose impartiality is prima facie to be accepted, then how can the police officer be exempted from following those provisions? And if the provisions are not followed by the magistrate, the confession will become suspect. The voluntariness will be doubted. But if the same precautions are not followed by a police officer, the confession would become, confession would still remain voluntary, because you will not consider the violation of those precautions, saying that these precautions are to be taken by magistrates, not by police officers. Now, such type of absurd judgments have been delivered. I was coming to this point because what Mr. Salman Khurshid said, I fully agree that he did not say it expressly. I will say it more explicitly. I don't find that the assessment of evidence or the rules of evidence which they apply in other cases are applied by the judges in cases involving TADA, POTA or UAPA, or the liberty so much they speak of. I don't think they, with the same zeal, they protect that. Maybe because they feel that is the will of the legislature. Of course, there are some draconian provisions, but there is, one thing is certain, that when there is no prima facie case, a person cannot be detained, and no such provision can be made. No provision can be read as enabling a court to detain a person in bail, whatever may be the wording of that, unless there is a prima facie case. But this is happening. Since that was said, I will say these are all dangers to the independence of judiciary, and the reason, I think, is the possibility of criticism. If the public unfairly also criticizes you, maybe that created criticism also, the political executive who wants to punish you for your views, gets a handle of the so-called public opinion. And I fully agree with Mr. Salman Khurshid that there is no question of public opinion, that collective conscience or the constitutional morality. I would say that these phrases, there is a danger, might be used to deviate from the accepted norms of interpretation of law in a given case. You don't want to apply the set rules which are accepted, and therefore you introduce such phrases. That possibility cannot be overlooked, and these phrases might be misused to deviate from the settled legal position. Anyway, so the media itself is a threat, to the judicial independence, according to me, and that is really paradoxical. I don't know how to means how to tackle the situation that is prevalent today, because the test of the independence of judiciary will be more in difficult times, when there is a atmosphere of intolerance as we are experiencing in last 7 8 years. Intolerance, then communalism. These are the times when independence of judiciary is uh, felt more strongly needed. The need of an independent or strong judiciary is more in such difficult times, when encroachment on the fundamental rights of citizens has become easy. Uh, as far as public opinion is concerned, I would, since he said, I would quote a judge from New Zealand who said, and I will quote from him. I got it somehow because it's good that he touched the subject. So I thought what he said is truly to be followed by every judge. He said, elected officials may consider popular urging and sway to public opinion polls. Judges must follow their oaths and do their duty, heedless of editorials, letters, telegrams, picketers, threats, petitions, panelists, and talk shows. What he said, in this country, we do not administer justice by plebiscite. And he was, of course, initially in 1770, Lord Mansfield has also said, which is, of course, quoted many times, but not every time followed. What he said, I will not do that which my conscience tell me is wrong, to gain the huzzas of thousands, or the daily praise of all the papers which come from the praise. I will not avoid doing what I think it's right, though it should draw on me the whole artillery of libels, all that falsehood and malice can invent, or the credulity of a deluded populace can swallow. Now, today, unfortunately, there are some judges who probably are afraid of doing justice because of public criticism. Sometimes they bona fide believe that a particular course is necessary because of bias. We can't have a detailed discussion on that, but it's not very wise to believe that the judges are absolutely free from bias because of their training. And in our society, there is not much discussion. Our legal community, there is not much discussion. But in other countries, even in Europe and America, many experiments have been made. And I will only say that bias exists in human mind. A man is inclined to believe more. A person who speaks his own language, is of his own culture, and who believes in the same values. He may doubt the truth of what uh, a person of a different culture says, a person of different appearance says. This has been researched while studying how the judges evaluate witness evidence, but that's all right. That's not. So another thing is that bias between the in the minds of judges, that is also uh, threatening the independence of judiciary. I will not touch the way in which appointments are done, and because there are judges, I have seen both extremes. At the lowest level, also, I can assure you that I have seen judges of great courage who have not deviated from their duty, who have not who were not carried away by the public opinion or the possible pressure put by the investigating agencies by different means, by bringing very high officials to argue the cases in their courts, etc., etc. But on the other hand, I have seen the judges of the highest level who are much more protected succumbing to such pressures. Otherwise, it is very difficult to rationalize the judgments. I did a lot of criminal work, and I found in one of the cases where there was big uproar about a bail granted by me in UAPA matters. And of course, fortunately for me, because one doesn't know, the advocates openly say that there is no uniformity in the views of the Supreme Court. Those orders were maintained. And but a very surprising thing, it was said that all the observations made are, they are expunged. Because I was told that the prosecution, means the state took a view, they advanced an argument before the Supreme Court rather, that this will virtually amount to acquittal, and this is the solution that was found by the Supreme Court. I find great force in another topic which he raised. I feel that sometimes the Supreme Court unnecessarily keeps a question alive just because there is a lot of public interest involved in that, or many people are involved. That is unnecessary. I know of one case where the question was whether the case would be one under 304A of the IPC, that is accident, that causing death by rash and negligent act, or it will be culpable homicide 304 part 2. It has become fashionable now to apply section 304 part 2 to accident cases in recent years after Bombay High Court started it. That's a different matter to be dealt with academically. We can't go into that. But there, what happened? The session court had said no, that this is the magistrate held that he refused to commit it. An application was made that this is culpable homicide and not an accident case, so you have to commit. He refused. That was challenged before the sessions court. The sessions court said that it is culpable homicide, so you commit it. This was again challenged before the High Court. High Court set aside the order of the sessions court, saying that this doesn't amount to culpable homicide, it's an accident case, it's 304A. But the man was a celebrity. People were against, there are many organizations, they filed PILs, this, that, everything combined went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld the action order of the High Court. The matter should have ended there. But surprisingly, the Supreme Court added, and I, not verbatim, it is not before me, but I will tell you what their lordships added. They said, however, if subsequently, when evidence is laid, it appears to the magistrate that this is culpable homicide, he can commit it to the Court of Session. Now see, what does it mean? This is a legal provision which they are citing, that is in the Code of Criminal Procedure, that if during the course of a trial evidence comes showing that a graver offense is committed, which the lower court cannot try, he will commit it to the Court of Session. But mentioning there, while dismissing the petition, was only to please those who wanted the battle to still be kept alive. Now this then took another 10 years of, because the magistrate thinks that this is a hint given to him, that this is what you have to do. And then he committed, then again so many things. I don't want to go further because we are not having sufficient time, and we will avoid discussing individual cases. Now, what is the solution to this now? I don't think that there is a ready solution. But the obvious solution will be to create an atmosphere in which the executive will be afraid of interfering with the independence of the judiciary. Can we create such an atmosphere? We should have a responsible political executive who believes in democratic values. I'm surprised to see when highly educated people have no respect for democratic values. Some positively, I have seen big technicians like engineers, scholars, they say that we want dictatorship in this country. I really fail to understand this basic ignorance of that. And I feel that the advocates, the members of legal profession, are different from other professions in these respects because they know how the society works. They know of the administration. They know the structure of the society better than other professionals know. So the judiciary will be brave and firm in resisting such attacks if the atmosphere is such, today the judges feel totally unprotected. The bar knows, bar openly speaks who are the good judges, who are the bad judges. Their preferences are very noticeable. But then the fight never becomes a fight with the political executive. The political executive is not afraid of causing harm to judges by, because nobody suffers. Uh, therefore, this independent and fearless bar can make this change possible. That is change of atmosphere. Bar in the past has already fought for the liberty and fundamental rights of the citizens. And it is the responsibility of the bar, according to me, to create an atmosphere where judges feel comfortable in giving decisions in accordance with law, even if they go against the will of the majority or the political executive. And one thing which I noticed, bar should not, when it comes to judicial independence, bar should not be divided by political considerations or by caste or community. They already also one thing which it is my novel thought, I mean, I have not read it anywhere, that bar should not indulge into loose talks about the inferiority of judges by comparing the high income of the members of the bar with comparatively lower salaries of the judges. This is another way of weakening the judiciary, because these two are totally different and income cannot be a criteria while comparing judges and advocates. Present day, I feel there is a strong and judiciary is needed more than any time previously in the history of India. Society has to make the judiciary strong. That is what my view is. And the society can be taught what is right and what is wrong by an independent bar who understands the importance of independent judiciary. Thus, I think we have already spent more time and we want to have more time for question and answers. I would conclude here and by thanking the organizers. And I was to meet Salman Khurshid during my visit in Delhi, but somehow it could not materialize and I could not remain present for the publication ceremony of his book. Thereafter, this corona and all that, we have not been able to, but good that at least in this virtual meeting, I was able to meet him this way. Of course, his knowledge, his experience is far wider and it is all round. Mine is limited from the inside. Whatever is I've seen from the outside is only after I stepped down as a judge after my retirement. So I congratulate the organizers for holding such seminars. The corona, I think that these now it is on decrease, and when good times normalcy is restored, we can have workshops for the whole day on chosen topics, and we can have a workshop for 2-3 days also, every day distributed between different topics of public importance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. It was really indeed an honor for us to have you, and with all your experiences and knowledge, it's really going to be very useful for all our viewers and all advocates who are present here today. I would like to ask our Honorable Chairman, Asif Qureshi, to virtually welcome Honorable Justice Mr. Abhay Tipseji. So with great honor, we would like to.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sir, thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
So now we go over to the question and answer session. I would request Sanjukta Chaudhary, our solicitor from MPCC, Secretary of Legal Department, and another secretary, Ravi Jadhav, advocate, both of them to take questions one by one.
I have a question. Many of my friends were asking whether the Chief Justice of India is higher post or the Member of Parliament is higher post. They are not satisfying with my answer, as our Chief Justice of India has taken the oath after his retirement as the Member of Parliament to Rajya Sabha. So all the people are thinking the Member of Parliament is the higher than Chief Justice of India, who is giving the oath to the President. So I would like to get the proper answer from Honorable Tipse sir and Khurshid sir ji. So this is very important question every Indian is facing. As we are the advocates, we are active in our law field as well as in politics. So what will be the guidance to the upcoming lawyers? Which way they have to go if they want to success and fame and name in their future? Please kindly guide us on this point, sir. Thank you.
Well, I think that there is a protocol which is very clear, government protocol that is laid down. The Chief Justice of India is much higher than an MP. MP has his own significant importance, but in terms of protocol, the Chief Justice is certainly much higher. So I don't think this is something that should concern you and worry you. When somebody holds the office of a judge and somebody holds the office of a Chief Justice of the High Court or of the Supreme Court, that in itself is a very significant position. Everybody is obviously in protocol below them, except for the president and the prime minister. That's all. But even the president and the prime minister, or certainly the prime minister, has to show due deference to a judge, to the chief justice. This is how we understand our system, and this is how we preserve the quality of governance in our country. So someone who sits on the bench is a very important person, and that's why we always have to bow, even to a magistrate. We always have to bow when we come to a magistrate's court, for instance. It doesn't matter who we are, but we have to bow to the magistrate, and that's how we see the system. So, if you are talking about succeeding in life, just remember this. Remember that there are courtesies. Remember there are protocols. Remember that there are aspirational positions, and that you honestly follow them and you work hard. You will succeed in life.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I don't know if Justice Thipse wants to add something to it.
No. Of course, in the order of precedence and protocol, Chief Justice of India is very high. MP is not even of the High Court judges level as per the rules of precedent. But after all, MP is an elected representative. He is a member of the parliament, so he is also important. I don't think this is very relevant for one's succeeding in life. I mean, you just can't say which position you have to aim for, depending on whether it is higher in the protocol or the order of precedence. So I don't know what is the exact purpose of this question, but of course, Chief Justice of India is a much higher position than, of course, MP. As I said, even a High Court judge's position is higher than MP as per the rules of precedence, which are then again framed by the government only.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. One question asked by Dr. Smita Shahpurkar. She said that there were clear media trials in case of Kasab's trial, and the prosecutor's media statements were adding to the fuel. This was pushing the public opinion towards the raid and creating anti-Congress tempo or party tempo. Another example is Afzal Guru. Can the court give orders to stop media trials, particularly when the case is under trial?
I mean, I think Justice Thipse would answer it, but obviously the law is very clear on it, including in the Supreme Court in the Sahara matter. The law is very clear. The courts can direct that there would be delayed reporting so that it doesn't interfere with the day-to-day arguments that are happening. Very special, unusual cases. There are directions by courts that nothing is to be reported, and there are unusual cases, rare of course, where matters are held in camera. So it's a balancing of the right to know and open justice system that we all subscribe to, and the need to protect individuals or to protect institutions. The courts are authorized to do this, and I don't think that there is a severe problem about this. But certainly we know that too much media reporting takes place. Some of it is not very responsible, but I think a bit of that we've taken our stride also. The judges take it in their stride as well.
Yes, I fully agree. See, as far as high courts and supreme courts have concerned, they have powers under different provisions to prohibit or delay the publication of the reporting. But the real issue, which I think is in your mind from the question, is not the faithful reporting of what happened in the
क्या
court.
बोलता है, बात कर.
It is the comments which are made by the public prosecutor after the day's work is over, and those are really dangerous and they can be prohibited. But there are various laws to protect that. I mean, if these statements are of such a nature and they indeed have tendency to pose serious threat to the trial, then always, of course, it amounts to contempt also, in fact. But as Mr. Khurshid said, that the judges, the minor things, that the prosecutor, he just boasts himself, just to boost his image, how well he is doing. These nobody takes a notice of, and nobody is bothered about that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. One Wilson.
Thank you. I think,
Wilson
sorry.
has adding to this question only has asked: is media governing everything is a big question or big problem?
Well, I think this is part of life. This is part. It's a necessary evil, if you like, because media is very critical to, and as our law has indicated, media is very important to freedom of expression, and there are special carve-outs for the media as well because of its responsibility. But that's just as there are other rights have obligations. This right also has its obligations and restrictions, and therefore regulations can be placed. Now, you do know what's happening with the matter relating to Twitter. There are two views on it, but the last word probably has to be and will be that whatever the law of the land is, that you have a level playing field, that everybody has to answer to the same standards and requirements of accountability, and therefore there cannot be an exception for Twitter.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yes, Sanjukta.
Yeah, I have a question for Salman, sir. I just wanted to know, sir spoke about constitutional morality. I just wanted to know that the court has something called the inherent powers, and also the inherent power to do justice and equity. So, does constitutional morality, in your view, also tie into this?
No, I think these are working instruments of adjudication. That there are sometimes you give a little discretion to the courts to take a view, just to move any impediments, remove any impediments that come and they are faced with. But it has to be seen in the total scheme of things. And the total scheme of things is that even a discretion is not an unguided discretion. It varies from what it is being given for, but there is an element of explicit or implicit guidance even for discretion. And ultimately, if we are able to pinpoint what constitutional morality is, which I do in the years to come, our discretion will be guided by, or for that matter, any other decision or choice of one or the other would be done on the basis of constitutional morality.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Mr. Advocate Satyajit Shirke has asked a question to Salman, sir. Sir, in recent year, your interview to Queen, you have said that we must return to our ideology to return to power. How challenging it in recent times?
Well, see, there's been recent politics, I think everyone knows, has pushed people to take transactional positions, to take steps that are steps that solve some immediate problem. But when you look at the larger picture of your aspiration as to where you want to go, you might find that those steps are counterproductive, or those steps are some kind of an impediment that reduces your sense of understanding. So we have to return, and everybody does this, We all have to return to the nets, as it were. When a cricketer is not scoring runs, he has to go back to the nets and then practice in the nets and work hard to get his form back, to get his flow back. I think everything has to be done in that manner, and certainly institutions, political institutions, have to do that periodically. Sometimes it happens naturally when some new leader takes over, and that leader puts you through that exercise. Sometimes, with business as usual, you have to urge yourself and persuade yourself, force yourself if need be, to get back to your roots, re-look at your roots afresh, re-understand them, and then even you can use the word reimagine those roots, and then come back with a more vigorous and more determined presence in public life.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. One question to Honorable Justice Tipseji from K.S. Pandit, Advocate K.S. Pandit from Beed. Whether taking political post immediately after retirement as a Supreme Court and High Court does cause hindrance in independence of judiciary?
Yes, it depends from case to case. If the post is given in return for something done while the person was doing his duties as a judge and an obvious favor, then of course that will amount to independence of, interference with the independence of judiciary.
Yes.
But not otherwise, because those who are taking, we take it the other way. People who are member of the political parties, and they can be elevated. There is no bar. I mean, that's a part of your, you can exercise a choice and become an ordinary member of any party. Now many such persons, you know that Krishna Iyer was a minister in a government before he became a high court judge. Then so many eminent people have accepted positions after the retirement also. They were interested with good responsibility. The question is really not that. This is a question created, I have some reservations about this question itself is false. The question is whether any post which you have got is whether because you did something to favor that party when you were a judge, did you pass such judgments that favored them, and whether therefore you have got this, then that is wrong, and that is of course a serious threat to the independence of judiciary. But without that, just because a person may have some political views or he may think a particular course suitable after his retirement, looking to the social scenario, and he feels that if he has to do something for the society, he has to adopt a particular course. In that case, how it can be said to be wrong? And for his eminence, suppose some position is given to him which is suitable to his experience and in which he can serve the society better, then that will not be a circumstance posing threat to the independence of judiciary. The question is therefore whether there is quid pro quo, means whether this post has been given in return of some favor which the person has done while as a judge. That is the issue. This question itself should be modified to that extent, and we should examine only that aspect, really speaking. This is what my view is.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. One question to Salman Khurshid, Honorable Salman Khurshid from Sri Krishna Kachwe. In the light of recent judgment, how can those three petitioners claim compensation for their unlawful detention? Picking a stone isn't an offense, but hurling it is. How can the police even frame them in UAPA? Let's IPC when they were simply protesting in a constitutional manner.
See, the High Court judgment is a very detailed judgment, and I personally believe a very good judgment. But at the same time, the Supreme Court has some queries. We should respect what the Supreme Court's concern and queries are. They may finally uphold the High Court judgment. In which case, I think the law will be good and very clear. If they don't uphold the High Court judgment, to what extent they will not uphold it, we'll have to examine, and then we can take a view on that. I think right now the issue is let the law be clear, not about their getting compensation right now. It'll take a little bit of time till the law becomes clear, and I think that this is a sacrifice, unfortunately, we have to make for the overall good of society. Because you cannot have instant judgments and you can't have instant compensation, etc. If the government was sensible and the government was considerate and compassionate, they might want to do something on their own as an interim measure. But it seems to me very unlikely that given the conditions in which we are, that there could necessarily be any positive step that might be taken before the Supreme Court can dispose of that matter. The best that we can hope for is that the Supreme Court will be quick and show alacrity in taking a decision.
Thank you, sir. One question to Honorable Justice Tipseji by Advocate Amol Borkhade. Once the crime is registered and investigation commence, media cannot show the collection of material spot and evidence, and it should be avoided by the court by making law and order. If they found, they may be penalized. What is your opinion and what you would like to add, sir? This is
See, the investigation papers, the media will not come to know because they are not to be given even to the accused. The accused is entitled to get the papers only after a charge sheet is filed. Before that, he is not entitled to. So how the media can get this is a question. And if the media gets, it must be leaked by the police only. And if that is so, if the investigating agencies are leaking this material to the press with oblique motive, sometimes it has happened also, I believe, then the court can take appropriate action, because the definition of contempt is very wide. And though the subordinate courts have no power to punish their contempt unless it is on the face of them, they can always make a reference to the High Court, and High Court can treat this matter as a contempt and take appropriate action. But as I said, that tribal matters are not to be taken notice of. If there is a serious threat, then of course the action of contempt should be taken. And it should be very easy to find out that who leaked this information, because the accused will not have such information.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us. Thank you.
sir.
Thank you very much.
So now we show the video of our Justice Tipsey sir's video. Can you please show? So our Justice Tipsey, he had come for a RERA program, and also when our Asif Kurezi ji was appointed the member of Bar Council of Maharashtra and Goa, he was elected. So he's there to guide us. And we had this wonderful panel discussion at Tilak Bhavan. This was at Hotel Samrat, when we all advocates were there celebrating the also coverage in the newspapers and videos, etc. Now I would like to propose a hearty vote of thanks. In fact, it was indeed a wonderful session, and I would extend my heartfelt gratitude to our legends, our legal luminaries. First of all, to Shri Honorable Salman Ji Khurshid for having accepted the invitation and having graced this occasion. And sir, all your valuable inputs and experiences and the knowledge what you have bestowed to us will be always memorable and will be carrying along and will be very helpful to us. I'm really honored that you have come here. My heartfelt thanks to Justice Tipsey ji. Sir, you have been always coming here and always giving us guidance, and all your journeys, experiences, what you have given us, the topics you all have chosen were wonderful, and your inputs, valuable inputs, experiences, knowledge, wisdom, all what I have got from these legal luminaries. I'm sure all of them, the viewers who have joined, have enjoyed the session very much. We are indeed very honored. I also thank our Honorable Chairman Asif Ji Kurezi for giving us encouragement and motivation to have such programs. Sir, I will also note that we will definitely have in future lot of workshops, maybe for a day or maybe more also, as our Tipsey sir told us. And with all the motivation, like our legal luminaries here today, like our legends here today who are going to support us, we will definitely have more such series of programs on different topics. So with great honor and respect, I would also like to thank our entire committee team who has been supporting us. Sanjukta Chaudhary is here, Ravi Jadhav is here, Vishwajit is here, Ashray is here, and Raghavan sir, and all the entire committee, whoever are here. I thank you all very much. Great honor and respect. Wish you all the best to all of you all. Be safe, be quarantined in case if necessary. And definitely we will even come to Delhi, sir, and meet you. So before I end, if Asif Qureshi wants to add something, sir, you're most welcome.
थैंक यू वेरी मच सर।
Thank you,
दिल की
sir.
गहराइयों से सर आपका शुक्रिया। डिप्टी सर और सलमान खुर्शीद सर का दिल की गहराइयों से बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया सर। आपने बहुत अच्छा गाइड किया हम लोगों को और ये हमारे आगे बहुत काम आएगा सर। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
थैंक यू
सभी
सर।
पार्टिसिपेंट्स का दिल की गहराइयों से शुक्रिया, धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू।
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
थैंक यू सर।
It
Thank
has
you, sir.
been a
Thank you.
wonderful
Thank you, sir.
session, and next session we are having of our youngsters, Solicitor Sanjukta Chaudhary, and also with him Mr. Amir. He will also be here. He's come all the way from London and he has done his masters. So Amir Qureshi and Sanjukta Chaudhary, please, all of you all are invited next time. Please come, and they're going to talk on cyber law, which is really very interesting. So please do come for the next session.
Thank you. Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
थैंक यू मैम।